Welcome to LHS Cast's Fall Talks podcast, where there is something to interest anyone with a connection to Mill City. This episode is titled Little Canada, written and narrated by Michael Daly. The year is 1964. The sounds of demolition equipment and smashing wood are ever so present. A neighborhood, once considered to be the second most densely populated in the United States, only beaten by Hell's Kitchen in New York, is now being demolished to make way for urban redevelopment. Le Petit Canada, or in English, Little Canada, was once the biggest cultural enclave in Lowell. But how did it get this way? Why was it demolished? Allow me to tell you the story of Lowell's Little Canada. In the mid-1800s, French Canadians living in their motherland of Quebec faced many challenges. A majority of French Canadians made a living in agriculture, but the land was becoming harder and harder to farm. In addition, they were often discriminated against by the English government of Canada. English Canadians, despite being the minority in Quebec, were often the most wealthy. While Quebec was suffering, New England was prospering. New industrial cities started popping up and attracting immigrants all across the world in search of employment. Poverty-stricken French Canadians followed this trend. They flocked to new industrial cities like Holyoke, Massachusetts, Manchester, New Hampshire, and the setting of our story, Lowell, Massachusetts. This migration is what historians call the Quebec diaspora. Samuel Marin is considered the main developer of this neighborhood. He came to Lowell from Quebec in 1857 after being hired by an American dry foods company. In the year 1865, he was hired by Lowell's Textile Corporation to recruit French Canadian families in Quebec to come and work in the mills. Marin's connections to the leadership of these companies allowed him to become the main developer of a vacant area near the Lawrence Mills. This is where many of the tenements that would house new arrivals were built. This is where Little Canada was born. From 1860 to 1900, the number of French Canadians in Lowell grew from a couple hundred to over 31,000. They quickly became the largest immigrant community in Lowell, the vast majority of them living in Little Canada. The community was so well knit together, it was almost as if they had never left Quebec. People who lived in this neighborhood spoke French more than they spoke English. French newspapers were founded, all masses were held in French, signs were all in French. Even the Jeanne d'Arc credit union that a lot of Lowellians, including myself, use to this day, was initially founded to serve French Canadians. Many French Canadian Lowellians have made history. Lowell, the man who composed O Canada, Canada's national anthem, actually lived and got married in Lowell in 1867. Louis Cyr, who is considered the strongest man to have ever lived, was born in Montreal and moved to Lowell with his family for a significant amount of time. Jack Kerouac, while not living in Little Canada, was there frequently and went to school in Little Canada. Despite being a defining author of modern American English literature, he has said he did not learn English until the age of 6. Growing up in the neighborhood of Pawtucketville, he is quoted as saying, "I am French Canadian, put into the world in New England. When I am mad, I often swear in French. When I dream, I often dream in French. When I cry, I always cry in French." You may be asking yourself, why was such a culturally rich community demolished? Well, in a word, poverty. The Great Depression hit Lowell incredibly hard. Mills were shutting down and jobs were becoming exceedingly more scarce. This greatly impacted Little Canada because most of its residents were employed by these mill companies. The community's main source of income took a massive hit. Residents were being laid off left and right, which made an already relatively poor neighborhood even poorer. To combat this, a lot of French Canadians offered to work in the mills for less, just to get by. To other immigrant and non-immigrant communities who were also struggling to stay afloat, they viewed this as job stealing, making the public perception of French Canadians pretty negative. The Irish community in Lowell especially disliked the French Canadians. Stories of Irish boys hurling rocks and insults at French Canadian boys were far too common. This stigma led to French Canadians needing to assimilate more into English-speaking culture. Slowly, many French Canadians moved out of Little Canada to other neighborhoods like Pawtucketville, Centerville, Belvedere, South Lowell, and their kids started speaking English in most places except for home and church. Little Canada's neighborhood started housing more and more non-French speakers. As French Canadians started to leave Little Canada, after years of poverty, so did its language. French slowly became a second language in the neighborhood, mostly spoken at home, school, or church. In 1964, the Urban Redevelopment Act was passed, and the demolition of the tenements that comprised Little Canada was approved. Today, the land where Little Canada once stood holds many of UMass Lowell's campus buildings, and all that is left of this neighborhood is the old St. Jeanne d'Arc Church, now not in use, the Club Passatons, and the plaque dedicating the neighborhood. It is inscribed "Jamais Souviens," which translates "Lest we forget."